Hello and welcome once again to Bible Class Topics. Today we begin a new study entitled Turning Points in the Life of Christ. It will be a series of lessons relating 7 crises in the life of Jesus Christ. According to Webster's dictionary, one definition of crisis or crises is a turning point in the course of anything, a decisive or crucial time, a stage or event. Another definition, a time of great danger or trouble whose outcome decides whether possible bad consequences will follow. So in this study, we want to talk about 9 topics, beginning with Lesson 1, the fall of man. And then we're going to look at 7 turning points in the life of Christ. We'll look at his baptism, his birth, then his baptism, his temptation, his transfiguration, his crucifixion, his resurrection, his ascension, and then we'll have a lesson concerning man's redemption. In other words, how we can use Jesus Christ to save our own souls. So the purpose of the study is to look carefully at these 7 great events in the life of Christ and relate them to the accomplishment of his divine work. It is only through these 7 crises that the entire story of the redemption of man can be properly told. Each of the events begin a new order of things in the work of Christ, brought to a perfect end, and which would bring to a perfect end the past crisis and set the stage for the crisis yet to come. So we've divided Lesson 1 into 2 parts. In this first part, we're going to discuss the fact that we have a need for Christ, and the need for Christ comes through the fall of man, and sin separates man from God. In the second part of this lesson, we'll talk about sin causing man to be ignorant of God, and then in the third part of the lesson, we'll talk about sin causes man to be unlike God. So in this video, we're going to discuss sin separates man from God. Under the topic of sin separating man from God, we want to talk about the nature of man, the process of man's temptation, and the fact that God will separate himself from man. Let's begin with a look at Genesis chapter 3. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden'?" And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew they were naked. They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths, and they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man and said to him, 'Where are you?' And he said, 'I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself.' And he said, 'Who told you you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree of which I command you not to eat?' And the man said, 'The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit of the tree, and I ate.' Then the Lord God said to the woman, 'What is this that you have done?' The woman said, 'The serpent deceived me, and I ate.' The Lord God said to the serpent, 'Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all the beasts of the fields. On your belly you shall go, and the dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. To the woman he said, I shall surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. And to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. Out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. The man called his wife's name Eve, because she was the mother of all living. And the Lord God made for Adam and his wife garments of skins, and clothed them. And the Lord God said, behold, the man has come to be like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever, we will send him out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. The only way for fallen man to be redeemed and reconciled to God, then, is through Jesus Christ. It is the purpose of this lesson to show the sorry state of man without Christ and how man got that way. In Romans chapter 5 and verse 12, Paul said, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men, because all men have sinned. So sin separates man from God. And the nature of man is that he is created in the image of and likeness of God. In Genesis 1:26 and 27, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. Paul tells the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 7, for a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. You might want to pause the video at this point and go take a look at these other passages you see on your screen. What does image mean? In the Old Testament, it meant a shadow. In the New Testament, it meant an outline or profile. The idea is resemblance, not an exact copy, not a clone. Man is no more a clear reflection of God than a man's shadow is a clear reflection of a man. God cannot be defined in terms of man, nor can everything about God be known by simply observing man. When Christ as a man is compared to man, Christ even as a man is shown to be greater. In Hebrews 1 and verse 3, he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purifications for sin, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Well, what then is the essence of man? The essentials. What are the essentials of man? He is essentially a spirit. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, Paul said, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Our bodies are only a temporal residence. They're not permanent. It is our spiritual essence in which we are the closest to being made God-like. It is our spirits, in our spirits, that we are made truly in God's image. Our spirits, then, are made up of three components: our intelligence, our emotion, and our will. God, of course, possessed a perfect measure of each, while man possesses only a shadow. God originally created man in his own image to live in union with him, a union based on the character and conduct of man. When man is in a right relationship with God, his intelligence is still limited compared to God's, but at least man understands what God has in store for him. In this godly relationship, man emotionally will love God with all his heart and let his will be energized by God's superior will. Man's outward behavior, then, is ultimately an expression of his inward intelligence. When man is in a right relationship with God, his works prove it. God created man and immediately placed him on probation. Man's nature is therefore encompassed by his will. In other words, God allowed and allows us today to choose whether we will stay in a right relationship with him or choose to leave that relationship. Without this freedom of choice, man would be nothing more than a robot. In the Garden of Eden, man was made the king, yet answered to God. Man was independent, yet dependent. Man had the right to choose, yet he had the right to make the wrong choice. In the words of Alfred Lord Tennyson, our wills are ours, we know not how. Our wills are ours to make them thine. Speaking of the process of man's temptation, we know that Satan made woman believe her liberty was being restricted by God. Her rights were being violated. Even though the restriction placed on Adam and Eve was to their benefit, Satan's lie convinced them that it wasn't. Satan's device was to slander God's character. This made man question the goodness of the law that had been presented to them by God. By making man think that God was restricting his knowledge by forbidding the fruit, Satan tricked Adam and Eve into thinking that God wasn't looking out for their best interest. We see now man's emotions are brought into play, and eventually man's emotions will be won away from God. The essential characteristic of the actual fall of man was one of independent action. That is, Adam and Eve failed to consult their father first before acting. By acting on his own, man dethroned God and enthroned himself, thereby separating himself from God and from God's kingdom, and in this case, the Garden of Eden. The inward and spiritual fall of man manifested itself physically in the act of taking down the forbidden fruit and eating it. Now we see God separates himself from man. Because man violated the covenant, he is removed from the benefits of the covenant. Well, what was lost to man? First of all, his holiness of character, then his righteousness of conduct, his immediate contact with the infinite knowledge of God, and his immediate contact with the perfect will of God. His intelligence then is darkened, his emotion is deadened, and his will is degraded. With the loss of his spirituality, man will turn then to material things to satisfy his intelligence, emotion, and will. Hopefully for man, God hears the call and sees the need for a deliverer to bring man out of this most pitiable and pitiful condition. Thank you for watching. We hope that you will get something out of this new series of lessons, the turning points in the life of Christ. I have many different types of lessons on this channel, and you could go to the home page of this channel, which you can click below to go there and look at the playlist that I have. Some lessons are as short as 6 or 7 minutes. Others stretch out to even 35 or 40 minutes long. I'm sure there's something there that would be of interest to almost any serious student of the Bible. I'll be looking forward to continuing this study with you next time, and until then, may God bless.